In this talk, I want to consider domestic groups, what they are, how they change over time, and how they are dissolved. First of all, what is the family? We need two different terms to describe the family. We need a term to describe an actual family, that is, parents and children, and the term that is often used is the nuclear family, described, for example, by Barnes as the association of a married couple with their young children. It is frequently a discrete residential and economic unit with its own dwelling and its own property. It is formed when the first child arrives. If the children grow up and leave to found families, its numbers decline, and it disappears with the death of the parents. But we also need a term for that entity, even when the children are not actually resident. And here, the term that is often used is the elementary family. This is defined again by Barnes as a unit consisting of a man and his wife and all their children, whether young or old, living at home or outside it, married or unmarried. So here you have a potential unit. Even those of you who are living away from home are members of an elementary family. Is such a family of a basic kind universal? If it were, then one would have some kind of building block from which one could build up whole societies and whole social systems. And therefore there has been a search for the universal nuclear or other family. Murdoch, for example, an American anthropologist, has written, "The nuclear family is a universal human social grouping, either as the sole prevailing form of the family or as the basic unit from which more complex familial forms are compounded. It exists as a distinct and strongly functional group in every known society." Unfortunately, as with almost all generalizations, there are exceptions to this. One we've already seen in the case of the South Indian Nayars, where we're told the local residential and property holding unit was a matrilineage segment of about 25 members. Each child was reared by its mother and matrikin. Its physical father might be unknown. The child had in effect no social father. In other words, there is no group of mother, father and children. In another case, in Central and South America, the nuclear family is generally replaced by a group based on what Adams, an anthropologist, has called the maternal dyad. That is, a residential unit composed of a mother and one or more children. For example, in parts of Paraguay, only 45% of the families actually had mothers, fathers and children living together. In the rest, it was just a woman living with her children. And the same has been found in British Guyana and elsewhere. This is not now such an unfamiliar pattern for us because, of course, we have a wide and growing number of one-parent families. This difficulty of defining the family has led anthropologists to think of families, rather than being blocks of people who live together, as complexes or sets of interpersonal relations, dyadic ties between parents or father and a child, a mother and a child, and so on. So that, in fact, one finds all sorts of combinations. There is no irreducible and universal molecule, the nuclear family, as we are discovering in our own society. Often, however, there are nuclear families, and these form the basis, and out of them grow much more complex forms. Indeed, in most societies, there are usually a large proportion of people living in units, family units, domestic groups, which are bigger than the nuclear family. A general term to describe these are compound families. One definition has suggested that a compound family is a unit consisting of 3 or more spouses and their children, in other words, a married couple and perhaps another wife or husband. It may be produced in monogamous societies by a second marriage, giving rise to step relationships. On compound families, Radcliffe Brown has written, "Such a family results in our own society when a widow or widower with children by a first marriage enters into a second marriage into which children are born. This gives such relationships as those of half-siblings and of step-parent and stepchild. In societies in which polygynous marriages are permitted, a compound family is formed when a man has 2 or more wives who bear him children. So we are, in fact, developing more and more compound families because of the breakdown and dissolution of marriages. The major types of compound family, apart from the ones with step-children that I've mentioned, are the following 2. There are what are known as stem families. This is when 2 nuclear families live together of different generations. In a typical case, in a farming family, say in southern France, you would find the aged parents living in the house, and one of their sons would have married and be living in the same house, and their grandchildren would be living there too. This is like a stem on a plant out of which there are shoots, and therefore it is known as a stem family. Another major type is what is known as the joint family. This is when 2 or more nuclear families are living together on the same generation. The most famous joint families are probably in India, where you have married brothers living in the same house. This is at least the ideal, although there are many cases where it breaks up. These 2 forms are also generally termed extended families. So the important thing is to distinguish between the family as an ideal or a theoretical construct and the family in actual existence. Anthropologists also term all these groups domestic groups. Maya Fortes, who's now dead, but whose pipe I have here with me, defined a domestic group as essentially a householding and housekeeping unit organized to provide the material and cultural resources needed to maintain and bring up its offspring. How are such domestic groups formed, and what are the pressures that lead to different kinds of formation? Well, one is clearly the residential pattern at marriage. This is an enormously important influence, where people decide to settle down after they get married. Anthropologists have distinguished 4 major types of residence at marriage. If the woman moves to the man's place, this is known as viri local, viri from the word for husband. If the man moves to the woman's place, this is known as uxori local. If there's a choice about where they go, but they have to go to one or the other, this is known as ambi local. And if they set up a new home away from both sets of parents of the bride and groom, this is known as neo-local. We, of course, tend to have a neo-local situation, though some of us may start marriage near one or other set of parents. As Barnes has pointed out, there is clearly some connection between customs of residence and descent. For no society is known in which descent is markedly patrilineal and residence invariably uxorolocal. Yet there's no perfect association. There are both virilocal and uxorolocal matrilineal societies. So marriage, residence, and the descent line, as we already saw in the question of the matrilineal puzzle, don't absolutely associate with each other. Now, one would think that the question of marriage residence was easy to ascertain. You go and ask someone where people tend to settle after they marry. But just to give an illustration of how difficult even such apparent facts are to establish in anthropology, perhaps I can recount the story of 2 anthropologists who went to work on a tiny island in the Pacific named Truk, and they did detailed censuses to find out what the marriage residence patterns were. And one of the anthropologists, they did this independently and not knowing that the other one had been there, and they published their results. One of them discovered that the islanders of Truk were 1.5% of them had patrilocal marriages. The other one found that 32% of them had patrilocal marriages. One of them found that 71% were matrilocal, the other 58% matrilocal. Now, matri and local is more or less equivalent to uxorilocal and patrilocal to virilocal. There was this huge discrepancy. What in fact they discovered was that the very subtle shifts in the emphasis of the way in which the questions had been asked and the interpretation put on the questions by their informants meant that the results were entirely different, and this led to a very large debate and the reformulation of a lot of kinship terminology. But it does illustrate that while we appear to have been talking about hard and fast things like who lives with whom, this is something which it is not in fact easy to establish. As well as marriage residence, another pressure which changes the family pattern is the developmental cycle of the human group. This again was something which was pioneered, the understanding of this, by Fortes, and the need for such a concept became evident in the middle of this century when anthropologists became more interested in change, fluidity and history, when it became obvious that you couldn't just take people as living in the same way all through their lives. It was clear that a more dynamic approach was needed to explain changes in family expectations and family structures. So a preliminary model was set forward by Fortes, who differentiated 3 stages in the development of human groups in all societies, which most of us will recognize. The first was the stage of expansion. This started when a couple get married and continued until they'd completed procreation, until the birth of the last child, the end of the wife's fertility. So you have a stage when the unit is growing larger and larger. Towards the end of this, you're beginning to get the second stage, which is the stage of dispersion or fission. Fission is a word often used by anthropologists. It means breaking apart, which is obvious, and the opposite of it, of course, is fusion. Well, the stage of dispersion or fission starts at the marriage of the eldest child, because this is the point at which, in these societies where marriage is much more a turning point than perhaps in our own, the family starts breaking apart. The child goes off perhaps to, if it's a girl, to her husband's place, and the nuclear family begins to disperse. And then the third stage is the stage of replacement, which ends with the death of the parents and the replacement of that group by the children's group. In such societies, the birth of the couple's first child and the marriage of the first child produced from that family are always crucial phases, much more important in many ways than our own. The birth of children, since in these societies, as we've seen, marriage is largely constituted around the central need for children. The birth of children is the turning point. As far as the variations in domestic groups is concerned, on the whole, it's true that among the simplest hunter-gatherer societies we looked at and the most complex industrial modern societies, which we will be looking at, you tend to have a simple nuclear domestic structure, parents and young children, and a very early fissioning of the family. In the majority of societies, that is the middle-range tribal and peasant societies, you tend to have variations of the complex and the compound families that we've been talking about, joint families, extended families of various kinds. We've talked about the change over time through the developmental cycle, but such domestic groups are also broken down by other pressures, and the main one is the dissolution of the domestic group through the breakdown of marriage. In general, the overall term that is used for this by anthropologists is the dissolution of marriage, because this allows one to talk both about divorce, absolute breakdown, and also separation. And it also allows one to talk about death, because the thing that tends to break down most marriages, of course, is death. For example, the economist Gunnar Myrdal, in looking at India, found that under the Indian mortality conditions of 1951, if a girl of 15 married a man 5 years her senior, which was more or less the normal pattern, the chance that the marriage would last until the wife's 50th birthday was less than 1 in 3. One or other of the couple would die before they both reached 50. And therefore, historically, up until very recently, what broke down most families, a very large proportion, was death. In Bethnal Green in the late 19th century, for example, by the time a child reached the age of 15, there was a 2% chance that the parents would have been divorced or separated, but there was a 29% chance that one or other of the parents would be dead by that age. So that, on the whole, it's death that breaks up families. The other, more sociologically interesting, because there isn't so much one can say about death, aspect is, of course, separation and divorce. Now, here again, our own society has a central inherited peculiarity, which is that it has forbidden, more or less forbidden, divorce. Full divorce with the right to remarriage has been forbidden in Christian societies for many centuries, and the laws have only recently, in the last 100 years, been changed to allow this. This is unusual because of 271 societies surveyed by anthropologists, only 4% actually forbid divorce, and 3/4 of them allowed it on the basis of mutual consent between the partners. So most societies allow, once they recognize that the marriage is not working, they allow the partners to break it up themselves. We have historically held that you cannot divorce for that reason. You could get only divorce in very limited circumstances. Recently, the situation, of course, has changed, and we're now faced with very high and rising divorce rates. The highest in Europe occur in England, for example, and many marriages break down. Anthropologists for a long time have been interested in what leads to high and low divorce rates, and indeed one of the most famous anthropological theories is concerned with how you explain differential divorce rates. This was originated in the work of Max Gluckman, who was working in Central Africa, and he put forward the interesting hypothesis that you could associate high and low divorce rates with different kinship systems. Very simply, he argued that in patrilineal societies, or agnatic societies where descent flows through males, you have a stable situation, stable dural relationships, and therefore low divorce rates. In matrilineal societies, because of the tension that we've talked about in the matrilineal puzzle, there's a basic instability, and therefore you have high divorce rates. And in bilateral societies, cognatic systems such as our own, which are based often on the principle of mutual affection between the partners, you get middling to high divorce rates. This thesis was naturally argued about and contested, and people have in fact found instances of patrilineal societies which have high rates of divorce. Lloyd Fallers found these, for example, among the Busoga of Uganda. The point in general that was established was that wherever you get extreme emphasis on the line, whether it's patrilineal or matrilineal, this leads to instability, because you get pulled in two directions. If you remember, a woman is a member of her patrilineage, the patrilineal group in which she was born, and if they make a great stress on her membership of that group, that is going to be a counter-pressure against her husband's rights in her and her husband's group's rights. So she is pulled in two directions. She will also get a lot of support if her marriage breaks down, and this, of course, is enormously important in allowing marriages to break down. As for bilateral systems such as our own, here we find that there isn't always a correlation. There are some societies, the Hadza, the very simple hunting-gathering society, and of course our own for many centuries when divorce was not allowed, where divorce rates were very low. What seems to have happened, though, is that in a society which does have cognatic bilateral systems such as our own, once you allow easy divorce, you may get a very rapid rise in divorce rates. And indeed, when our marriage and family system is introduced into many parts of the third world which have had very low divorce rates, it often has the effect of leading to very high instability of marriage. In the following talk, I want to look at some of the patterns created by sexual relationships.